It all began in a small, quiet town where Jessica Carter, a young single mother, lived with her 3-year-old daughter, Lily. Jessica had always done her best to create a loving home for her daughter. She worked long hours as a waitress, trying to make ends meet while ensuring Lily had everything she needed. Their life wasn't perfect, but they made it work. Lily, with her bright eyes and contagious laughter, was the center of Jessica's world. Every evening after work, they would sit down for dinner and watch cartoons together, finding joy in the little moments they shared. But everything began to change the day Jessica met 16-year-old Brandon Miller. Brandon came into their lives through a mutual friend. He was a troubled teenager who had been in and out of foster care for most of his life. He had a rough past, with stories of violence and anger issues, but he appeared different when he met Jessica. He seemed charming, at first kind, sweet, and eager to help around the house. He offered to take care of Lily when Jessica was working late, and at first Jessica thought it was sweet that he wanted to help. He told her that he wanted a fresh start, that he wanted to be part of a family. Jessica, who had been lonely for some time, felt a sense of relief. She finally had someone to lean on, someone who seemed to care. Brandon seemed to be good for her, and for the first time in months she felt like maybe her life was starting to look up. He moved in with Jessica and Lily after only a couple of months of dating, and things initially seemed fine. They went on outings together, took family pictures, and everything appeared to be normal. But behind closed doors, things were different. As the weeks went by, Jessica started noticing subtle changes in Brandon's behavior. He began getting frustrated more easily. He would snap over small things, like when Lily accidentally spilled her juice or when she made too much noise. At first, Jessica shrugged it off, thinking it was just a phase. But then, there were moments when Brandon's anger seemed to come out of nowhere, and Lily would cower in the corner, looking at him with wide, fearful eyes. Jessica tried to reassure her daughter, telling her that everything was fine, that Brandon didn't mean to scare her. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the tension that had started to settle in their home. Lily, who used to be full of energy, started to change too. She became more withdrawn, less talkative, and her once bright smile began to fade. Jessica didn't know what to think. She was blinded by her love for Brandon, convinced that things would get better. She believed his promises that he was changing, that he was doing this for her and for Lily. But Lily's behavior continued to worsen. She became more afraid, and there were nights when she would cry herself to sleep, clutching her stuffed bear tightly. Jessica, too caught up in the idea of their perfect little family, ignored the signs. She thought that maybe Lily was just going through a phase, that things would improve over time. But the truth was far darker than Jessica could ever have imagined. The warning signs were there, all around her, but she couldn't see them. What seemed like a fairy tale of a young family was slowly unraveling into a nightmare, and Lily was the one paying the price. The terror that would soon befall her was something no one could have predicted. What started as a seemingly innocent relationship had evolved into something much more dangerous. And the little girl, who once filled their home with laughter, was about to face the horror of her young life. As time passed, the signs of trouble became harder to ignore, but Jessica, still clinging to the hope that Brandon was the answer to her prayers, dismissed everything as minor issues that would eventually resolve themselves. Lily's quietness only grew, and her once bubbly personality seemed to be replaced by a deep sense of fear. She no longer wanted to play with her toys or engage in the games she once loved. Instead, she would sit in the corner of the room, her small hands clutched tightly around her stuffed bear, her eyes often scanning the room nervously. There were moments when she would flinch at the sound of Brandon's footsteps or look up at Jessica with a silent, pleading expression. But Jessica, too consumed by her relationship with Brandon and her desire for stability, failed to recognize the severity of the situation. Things escalated slowly but steadily. At first, it was just minor incidents. Brandon would snap when Lily would make noise or not listen to him. When she accidentally knocked over a glass of milk, he would yell at her, his voice harsh and frightening. Jessica, though uncomfortable, told herself that Brandon was just stressed, that he was under pressure, and that it wasn't a big deal. She would tell Lily to be quiet and try to diffuse the situation by soothing Brandon, but inside, a nagging feeling was growing. It wasn't long before the bruises started to appear. At first, they were small, easily explained away as accidents. Lily would fall while playing, or she would bump into something while running around. Jessica would kiss her daughter's bruised knees and assure her that it was nothing. But in the back of her mind, a little voice whispered that something wasn't right. The bruises began to multiply. One day, Lily came home from playing in the yard with a large bruise on her arm. It was dark purple and the shape was odd, as if it had been caused by someone gripping her too tightly. Jessica didn't know what to think. She asked Lily what happened, but the little girl just shrugged, not wanting to say anything that might upset her mother. Brandon, of course, had an explanation. He said that Lily had tripped over her own feet and had fallen into a bush, which didn't make sense. But Jessica, still not ready to confront the possibility of abuse, nodded and accepted the excuse. After all, children get hurt sometimes, don't they? As the weeks passed, the injuries became more severe, and Jessica could no longer deny that something was wrong. Lily's behavior was changing in ways that Jessica couldn't ignore. The once vibrant, curious little girl had turned into a shadow of herself, constantly hiding away from others, as if expecting something bad to happen. The love and joy that had once filled their home had been replaced by an air of tension and fear. Jessica began to notice that when Brandon was in a bad mood, the atmosphere in the house grew unbearable. He would lash out over small things like when Lily made a mess or didn't finish her dinner. But Jessica couldn't connect the dots. She still believed that everything was fine. She was still holding on to the illusion that they were a family, that things would get better if she just gave Brandon more time. One afternoon, Jessica received a call from their neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, who had always been friendly and kept an eye on Lily when Jessica wasn't around. Mrs. Thompson sounded concerned, telling Jessica that she had noticed bruises on Lily's arms and that the little girl seemed unusually withdrawn. At first, Jessica was defensive. She insisted that Lily was fine, that kids get bruises all the time, but Mrs. Thompson wasn't convinced. She gently suggested that Jessica take Lily to see a doctor or speak to someone about it. That night, Jessica's thoughts were consumed by the conversation. She tried to tell herself that Mrs. Thompson was just overreacting, but deep down she knew something was terribly wrong. She just didn't want to face it. Later, when Jessica tried to confront Brandon about Lily's bruises, he became defensive and angry. He denied everything, insisting that he had nothing to do with it. He promised Jessica that everything was fine, that Lily was just clumsy. Jessica, still blinded by her emotions and her desire to keep her family together, let it go. But the unease lingered, gnawing at her. The little voice in her head grew louder, but it was drowned out by her desperate hope that things would somehow improve. The truth, however, was becoming clearer. Jessica had allowed her love for Brandon to cloud her judgment, and as the months went on, It was only a matter of time before things would spiral out of control. Lily's quiet suffering was being ignored, and the little girl who had once brought so much joy into their home was now a shadow of herself, waiting for the inevitable. The signs were all there, but Jessica was too blinded by her need for love and acceptance to see the danger lurking in their home. One evening, everything changed. Jessica had planned to stay late at work to cover a shift for a colleague who had fallen ill. She kissed Lily goodbye, assuring her that she would be back soon. Lily, however, seemed uneasy as she clung to her mother, her small fingers gripping the hem of Jessica's shirt. Her once bright eyes looked clouded with fear, but Jessica, distracted by the stress of work, reassured her that everything was fine. She told her daughter she would be home before bedtime. Brandon was already there when Jessica left. She trusted him to look after Lily. He had been around for months now, and they had settled into a routine, even though things weren't always smooth. But tonight something felt different. The air in the house felt heavier than usual, and Jessica didn't even know why. Perhaps it was just her own exhaustion from work, or perhaps a lingering sense of unease that she had been trying to ignore for weeks. She kissed Lily goodbye one last time, unaware that it would be the last time she would ever see her daughter alive. As Jessica went about her evening shift, the hours seemed to drag on. Back at home, Brandon's temper was already flaring. He had been irritated for the past few days, snapping at small things, and tonight his fuse was even shorter. When Lily accidentally spilled her juice all over the couch, something inside Brandon snapped. The sound of the liquid splashing onto the fabric seemed to trigger something inside him. In that moment, all the built-up frustration and anger poured out. He screamed at her, his face contorting in rage, his voice dark and menacing. Lily, terrified, began to cry, her small hands trembling as she tried to clean up the mess. Brandon didn't care. In his mind, this was just another act of defiance. Another instance where he felt disrespected. His anger blinded him. He grabbed Lily roughly, shaking her to stop her crying, his grip tightening around her small frame. As she tried to pull away, he became more forceful, pushing her against the wall. The young child, barely able to comprehend the situation, was now in the grip of someone she should have been able to trust. It wasn't the first time Brandon had shown this kind of anger, but tonight it was different. His rage consumed him, and it took everything for Lily to try and escape. She whimpered, trying to say something, but all that came out was sobs. Brandon didn't hear her. All he could hear was his own fury, and nothing could make him stop. In his mind, she had to be punished, and nothing else mattered. Lily's attempts to fight back grew weaker, and Brandon, no longer in control of his actions, did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He bit her. It started as a single sharp bite to her arm, the force of it so intense that Lily screamed in agony. The pain must have been excruciating, but Brandon didn't stop. As Lily struggled, he bit her again, each bite fueled by rage, his mind unraveling further. Lily screamed, her small body writhing in his grasp, but it was futile. Her screams filled the air, but no one could hear her. By the time Brandon realized what he had done, it was already too late. He looked down at the small girl in his arms, her body limp and still. Her breathing had slowed, and the life seemed to drain from her. Panic set in. Brandon shook her, trying to wake her up, but it was no use. The child he had hurt so badly, the child he had never really cared for, was gone. His mind raced with fear, and for the first time, he truly understood the weight of what he had done. But instead of calling for help, instead of doing the right thing, Brandon panicked. He looked at Lily's lifeless form and tried to hide what had happened. He quickly cleaned up the mess, wiping down the furniture, moving her body in such a way that no one would suspect anything was wrong. He didn't know what to do or how to explain what had happened. He feared the consequences, not just from the law, but from Jessica, from the world. He couldn't bring himself to face the reality of what he had just done. When Jessica came home, she had no idea that the nightmare had already unfolded. She walked in, expecting to see Lily running to greet her, but there was nothing. The house was eerily silent. She found Brandon sitting on the couch, his face pale and sweating, his hands shaking. He didn't say a word as Jessica walked toward her daughter's room. She froze as soon as she saw Lily. Her little body was cold, lifeless, and covered in bruises. There was no movement. The reality hit Jessica with a crushing force. She screamed, rushing to Lily's side, but there was nothing she could do. Her daughter was gone. Brandon, sitting quietly in the other room, knew he had crossed a line he couldn't come back from. His world was shattering, but in his panic, he didn't know how to fix it. He had taken a life. He had taken the life of an innocent child. And now, he was about to face the consequences of his actions, though he still didn't understand the full extent of the tragedy he had caused. When Jessica saw Lily's lifeless body, her heart stopped. The world around her seemed to fade away as she collapsed beside her daughter. She shook her, desperate for a sign that Lily was still alive. But there was nothing. The little girl she had held in her arms, the child who had once filled their home with laughter, was gone. The room felt suffocating, as though the walls were closing in on her. The warmth that once radiated from Lily's tiny body was now replaced by a coldness that chilled Jessica to her core. Panic gripped her as the reality of what had happened sank in. Her mind couldn't process it. She screamed, calling out Lily's name over and over, hoping, wishing for her to wake up, but there was no answer. Her hands trembled as she cradled her daughter's lifeless form, tears streaming down her face. The love she had for Lily, her beautiful daughter, seemed to slip through her fingers like sand, and all she could do was cry out in disbelief. In the other room, Brandon sat in silence. His heart raced, and his palms were sweaty as he stared at the floor. He had never imagined it would come to this. He had lost control, and in that moment, he realized that his actions had shattered everything. He could feel the weight of what he had done pressing down on him, but there was no way to undo it. There was no way to bring Lily back. The guilt gnawed at him, but there was something deeper, a fear that consumed him completely. He knew that he couldn't face the consequences of his actions. His life, as he knew it, was over. Jessica's screams echoed through the house, snapping Brandon out of his trance. He could hear her frantic cries, her voice filled with agony and confusion. He knew what he had to do next, but in his mind, all that mattered was covering up the truth. The fear of being caught, the fear of losing everything, was too much for him to bear. He couldn't let Jessica know what had really happened. He couldn't let anyone know the true horror of what he had done. As Jessica continued to scream, Brandon stood up slowly, his body trembling. He knew it was time to act, to make the reality of the situation disappear. He had to make it look like an accident, like something that could be explained away. He couldn't let anyone suspect that. He was responsible for the death of this innocent child. Without thinking clearly, he moved toward Lily's body.
He began to rearrange the scene, hoping to make it look as though something had happened to her while he wasn't looking. He wiped away any trace of his involvement, trying to remove any evidence that could link him to the crime. but no matter
how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the truth. The bite marks, the bruises, the unmistakable signs of abuse, they would not be erased. No amount of cleaning or rearranging could change what had happened. Jessica finally stopped screaming. She was exhausted, her cries now reduced to soft sobs as she sank to the floor, her eyes never leaving her daughter's lifeless body. Horror was too much for her to comprehend, and her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. How could this be real? How could Lily, her little girl, be gone? Brandon, standing in the doorway, watched her, his face devoid of emotion. He knew that the truth would come out eventually, but for now, he was focused on covering his tracks. He couldn't allow himself to be caught. He couldn't face the consequences of what he had done. But in that moment, Jessica slowly looked up at him, her tear-streaked face filled with confusion and pain. "What happened?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Brandon didn't respond at first. The guilt was eating him alive, but he couldn't bring himself to speak the words. Instead, he simply shook his head, pretending not to understand. "I don't know," he muttered, his voice weak. She must have fallen or something. I don't know, Jessica. I didn't do anything." Jessica stared at him, her eyes searching for answers in his face, but she found none. She didn't know what to believe. The world around her was spinning, and all she could do was clutch Lily's small, cold body and hold on to what little sanity she had left. But deep down, something in her gut told her that Brandon was hiding the truth. She couldn't explain it, but she knew. The next few moments were a blur of confusion. Jessica's sobs became louder as she clung to her daughter, unable to fathom that Lily was truly gone. Brandon, now more fearful than ever, stood back and watched, his heart racing. He was terrified that the truth would come out, that the lies would unravel before his eyes. But as Jessica called for help, as she screamed for someone to save her daughter, Brandon remained silent, a dark secret eating away at him from within. The truth was out there, but for now, he had to pretend. Pretend like everything was normal. Pretend that he hadn't just taken an innocent life. The arrival of the paramedics was a blur. Jessica's screams echoed through the house as they rushed to her side, attempting to assess the situation. Brandon stood by, his body stiff and rigid, trying to avoid eye contact with anyone. He was trapped in his own web of lies, the weight of his actions pressing down on him with each passing second. The paramedics worked quickly, but it was clear to them from the moment they entered the room that there was nothing they could do. Lily's body was cold and unresponsive, her injuries too severe for anything to help. As they prepared to take her away, Jessica's cries grew louder, more desperate. She clung to her daughter, unwilling to let go. It was as if, in that moment, she was hoping that by holding on tight enough, she could somehow reverse the unthinkable tragedy that had just unfolded. But no matter how much she pleaded, there was no coming back from this. Her daughter was gone. The police arrived shortly after the paramedics, their presence heavy with authority. Jessica was still in shock, sitting on the floor, her face pale and tear-streaked, her hands trembling as she looked at Lily. The officers exchanged glances, already suspecting foul play. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication of a break-in. It was clear that the tragedy had occurred within the home, likely involving someone close to the victim. They began questioning Jessica, gently asking for details, trying to piece together the events leading up to the death. Jessica, though overwhelmed by grief, tried to answer their questions. but she kept repeating one thing. I don't know. What happened? I don't understand. She couldn't make sense of what had just occurred. Her mind raced, trying to find any explanation, but there was nothing that could justify the horrific scene in front of her. Meanwhile, Brandon remained silent, standing a few feet away from the conversation. His palms were clammy, and his heart pounded in his chest. He tried to look calm, to appear unaffected, but the fear was evident in his eyes. Every second felt like an eternity, and he could feel the police watching him, as though they already knew he had something to do with it. His mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. Should he speak up? Should he confess? But deep down, he knew that there was no turning back. He was in too deep, and there was no way to cover up the truth. Detective Harlow, the lead investigator, took a special interest in Brandon. She noticed the way he avoided eye contact, the way he fidgeted nervously, and the way his hands kept trembling. Something about his demeanor didn't sit right with her. She asked him to sit down and answer a few questions. Brandon hesitated, his throat tightening as he nodded and took a seat. He tried to keep his voice steady, but it cracked under the pressure. He told them what he thought happened, how Lily had fallen, how she had accidentally hurt herself. But Detective Harlow wasn't convinced. She had seen this before, the signs of someone trying to cover up a crime. As she pressed him further, she noticed small inconsistencies in his story. He couldn't keep his answers straight. He seemed too nervous, too rehearsed. His explanations didn't make sense, and the more he spoke, the more the detective began to piece together the truth. After hours of questioning, Brandon finally cracked. The walls of fear and guilt that he had built around himself crumbled under the pressure. He knew the truth had come out, that there was no escaping what he had done. He confessed. He told them everything, how his anger had taken control, how he had hurt Lily, how it had started with a small incident that spiraled out of control. He described in chilling detail how he had bitten her, how the force of his anger had overwhelmed him. Jessica, who had been listening to the interrogation from the other room, was in shock. She couldn't comprehend what she was hearing. Her mind refused to accept the reality of what Brandon had done. How could someone she had trusted, someone she had allowed into her life, do something so horrific? The man she thought she knew was a monster. Detective Harlow, though sympathetic to Jessica's pain, knew that the case was clear. Brandon was arrested that night, charged with the murder of 3-year-old Lily Carter. He was taken into custody, his life shattered by the consequences of his own actions. As the investigation unfolded, more details came to light about Brandon's troubled past. He had a history of violence, of anger issues that had been overlooked by everyone, including Jessica. But it was too late for that now. Lily's life had been stolen in the most brutal way, and nothing would ever bring her back.